Under the blazing light of the twin suns, the training grounds of the Galactic Academy stretched out like a vast, unforgiving plain. Jagged rocks punctured the soil in uneven patches, and thorny vegetation sprawled across the landscape, hiding sharp barbs beneath deceptively soft leaves. The air shimmered with heat rising from the ground, while in the distance, the outlines of low hills promised shade, but offered no real escape from the demands of the assignment. Alien cadets of every shape and color gathered in a semicircle, their bodies casting long shadows against the cracked terrain. Some clicked mandibles nervously, others adjusted the equipment strapped to their bodies, and a few whispered in hushed tones, their voices betraying the weight of expectation. At the center stood the instructor, an imposing Altarian officer whose crystalline body refracted the sunlight into dazzling rays that streaked across the assembled group. His faceted eyes swept over each cadet in turn, and his voice rang out with authority that silenced even the most restless student. He announced the parameters of the survival trial with deliberate clarity, as though daring anyone to misunderstand. The task was simple in words, but daunting in execution. Before the suns dipped below the horizon, every cadet was required to construct a shelter strong enough to withstand the planet's unpredictable storms, and cool enough to provide relief during the long, cold night. It was not a contest of aesthetics or grandeur, he emphasized, but of function, durability, and speed. The cadets nodded, some with eager confidence, others with visible unease. For most alien species, this kind of challenge played directly into their cultural pride. Shelter building had been ritualized for generations among the Korvaki warriors, who believed that strength came from the structures one could raise with claw and muscle. The insectoid Chiral cadets treated it as a test of engineering, their resin-based hives often crafted to withstand predators larger than starships. The reptilian Grail saw it as an opportunity to prove endurance, dragging massive logs and stones into place as a demonstration of physical might. Each species carried centuries of tradition and honor into the assignment, and to fail would mean humiliation not just for the individual, but for the clan or hive represented. Amid this sea of alien pride stood the human cadet, a figure who looked far less imposing than the towering insectoids or glittering Altarians. He adjusted the strap of his pack and glanced around at the others, sensing the undercurrent of mockery directed his way. Humans were still new to the Academy, admitted only after long debates within the Galactic Council. Many alien cadets saw humans as soft, fragile creatures from a dangerous but primitive world. The idea that such a being could succeed in a survival trial designed to test the best of the galaxy was almost laughable to them. Yet the human remained silent, his face calm, his eyes studying the terrain with a quiet focus that seemed to ignore the whispers. The instructor raised a crystalline hand, signaling the start. A sharp tone reverberated from the Academy's hovering drones, marking the beginning of the challenge. Immediately, the grounds erupted into motion. The insectoid cadets scuttled in coordinated swarms, secreting resin from their bodies to form sticky strands they layered into frames. The crystalline Altarians began hammering shards of stone together, shaping angular walls that caught the light like glass. The reptilian Grail slammed their tails into the earth, breaking the surface to anchor heavy logs that required 3 of them working in unison to drag into place. The atmosphere grew electric with effort, determination, and competitive pride. Dust rose in clouds as claws scraped against rock, mandibles clicked orders, and tails lashed with brute force. Amid the chaos, the human did not rush. He stepped away from the others, walking toward the edge of the training grounds where sparse trees grew in twisted shapes. His movements were measured, his gaze scanning for resources rather than tools. While the aliens exhausted themselves with elaborate constructions, he bent to examine the ground, scooping up a handful of dirt and letting it crumble through his fingers. He studied the trees, noting which branches bent without snapping, and looked at the broad leaves that shone with a waxy sheen. He pressed one leaf between his palms, testing its strength, then smeared mud along its surface and nodded to himself. Around him, the aliens barely noticed his absence. To them, he was already an afterthought, destined to fail quickly or create something laughable. The insectoids jeered loudly as their resin structures began to take shape, glowing faintly in the sunlight. The crystalline Altarians carved inscriptions into their walls as though victory was already theirs. The reptilian Grail grunted with satisfaction as their logs stacked higher, sweat dripping down their scales as they prepared to crown their shelter with heavy stone. None of them realized that the humans' quiet observation and deliberate pace were not signs of weakness, but of strategy. The instructor's faceted eyes, however, lingered on the human for a moment longer than on the others. He had overseen countless trials, and he had learned to recognize the difference between hesitation and calculation. Though he betrayed no hint of it, a fragment of curiosity stirred within him as he watched the lone figure move with purpose among the trees. It was not about mud or leaves, nor even about shelters. It was about perception, expectation, and the silent weight of alien judgment pressing down on one human cadet who carried the burden of proving his species worthy of standing among the galaxy's best. While the alien cadets raced against time and tradition, the human was already rewriting the terms of the challenge in his mind, approaching it not as a contest of pride, but as a problem of survival. The assignment had begun, and the seeds of astonishment were already being planted in the dust of the training grounds. The training grounds became a hive of activity as the alien cadets threw themselves into the work with the kind of fervor that could only be fueled by pride, tradition, and the unspoken competition between species. Dust clouds rose into the air, shimmering in the intense sunlight, while guttural commands, clashing stones, and the sticky hiss of resin echoed across the plain. Each group of cadets worked according to the methods of its people, demonstrating techniques refined over centuries of survival on hostile homeworlds. The insectoid cadets, their carapaces glinting in shades of obsidian and bronze, moved in perfect coordination. Each member of the Chiral cluster knew his role. One produced a thick, amber-like resin from glands at the joints of his limbs, smearing it with careful precision across jagged branches. Another layered the resin strands into overlapping sheets, hardening them into walls as strong as bone. A third used his razor-edged limbs to trim excess material, ensuring the lines of the hive structure were symmetrical. The ground around them became sticky with resin, and the pungent scent of it clung to the air. Already their hive began to rise like a strange organic dome, glowing faintly under the suns. Watching them, one might believe the task was already decided. The crystalline Altarians approached the assignment with the kind of stubborn elegance that mirrored their own bodies. A tall cadet with translucent arms hoisted a shard of stone as though it were as light as paper, slamming it into place with a ringing crack. His partner followed, fitting smaller shards along the seams like puzzle pieces, ensuring no gap remained. The Altarians prided themselves on geometry, and each wall they raised stood at perfect right angles, glinting as though a craftsman's hand had shaped it. Sweat did not bead on their faceted skin, but the faint fractures forming along their arms betrayed the strain of their labor. Still, they pressed on, determined to construct something both practical and monumental, for an Altarian never separated survival from artistry. The reptilian Grail approached the task with raw power. One cadet wrapped thick cords of plant fiber around his scaled shoulders, dragging a massive log across the plain. His claws tore grooves into the soil as he hauled it to the site where another cadet crouched, hammering an anchor into the earth with the weight of his tail. The sound of splitting wood rang out as logs were stacked, lashed together with vines, and pressed into rough frameworks resembling hunting lodges. Each Grail roared encouragement to the others, their deep voices carrying across the grounds like thunder. The structure rose slowly but steadily, and although it lacked refinement, it radiated strength and durability. To them, every log hauled was a statement of dominance. Other species contributed their own unique methods. A Remnari cadet extended flexible tendrils into the soil, drawing moisture that hardened into a clay-like substance. He smeared it over a frame of sticks, creating a dome that smelled of wet earth. A delicate Etherian floated silently above the ground, exuding a field of energy that solidified sand into compact slabs. She arranged the slabs carefully, her motions fluid and precise, her shelter rising like a crystal grown from the desert floor. The variety of methods created a dazzling panorama of alien ingenuity. From one end of the plane to the other, shelters of every imaginable design began to take shape, each infused with the cultural pride of the builders. Yet despite the furious activity, the hours slipped away with little to show for the relentless labor. Resin domes sagged under their own weight and had to be rebuilt. Crystalline walls collapsed when one shard cracked too deeply. Grail logs tipped over as their lashings failed, forcing the reptilians to start again with gritted teeth and angry roars. The more the cadets rushed, the more mistakes crept into their work, and the sunlight that once promised endless hours began to slant lower, throwing long shadows across the plain. By the third hour, tempers flared. A crystalline cadet snarled at his partner, accusing him of aligning a shard at the wrong angle. A charal slapped another across the mandibles for wasting resin on an unnecessary seam. A growl roared in frustration when his log snapped in half, the fibers inside too dry to hold together. The air grew thick not only with dust and sweat, but with the sting of wounded pride. All the while, the human remained apart from the chaos, working in silence on his own project. Most cadets did not even glance at him, consumed as they were with salvaging their efforts, but the few who did spared him only smirks of contempt. To them, his task seemed beneath notice, his frame too small, his hands too frail compared to claws, talons, and crystalline arms. The assumption that he would fail was so firmly planted that no one questioned it. Still, the murmurs grew. Whispers passed from one group to another, mocking the simplicity of his movements. A crystalline cadet scoffed loudly, asking why the human had not been sent to fetch water instead of being allowed to participate in the trial. A Grawl laughed, his deep voice booming, suggesting that perhaps the human's kind should be tested on something more fitting, like weaving baskets for food. Even the instructor, who maintained a stern silence throughout, could not completely ignore the dismissive atmosphere. His eyes, faceted and unreadable, flicked once toward the human before returning to the broader chaos. The cadets were too absorbed in their struggles to realize that the human was not falling behind. He was not racing, nor was he competing in the same sense as the others. He was methodical, his pace unhurried, his resources minimal. Yet there was an efficiency to his work that contrasted sharply with the grandiose efforts around him. As the sun's edge lowered in the sky, fatigue began to take hold. The insectoid cadets sagged under the weight of their half-finished hive, resin dripping sluggishly from tired glands. The crystalline Altarians stared with frustration at their cracked walls, their perfect geometry fractured beyond repair. The Grail panted heavily, their scales darkened with exertion as they dragged yet another log into place. Even the Etherian's energy field flickered faintly, the slabs she conjured crumbling at the edges. Pride had driven them, but pride now became a burden heavier than any log or stone. The second phase of the trial was not about innovation, but about endurance, and many of the cadets were discovering the limits of their strength. Yet still, none of them considered that the simplest, quietest effort among them might outlast their grand designs. The human's work stood mostly unnoticed, a lean frame of leaves and mud rising in unassuming silence at the edge of the plain. The part of alien effort had unfolded in sweat, pride, and frustration, but it was not finished. The storm yet to come would test more than labor. It would reveal whose shelter was a monument to arrogance and whose was a testament to survival. The human worked in silence, unaffected by the growing noise of frustration and anger that spread across the grounds. His boots pressed softly against the dusty soil as he moved toward the line of twisted trees. his eyes scanning every detail with the quiet precision of someone who had learned survival not from textbooks, but from necessity. He knelt at the base of a tree and tested a branch by bending it back and forth. When it bent without breaking, he snapped it cleanly with a sharp twist of his wrist and set it aside. He repeated the motion several times, selecting branches not for size or strength but for flexibility, envisioning how they would lock into place. Every motion was practiced, every decision guided by an instinct that made him seem more like a craftsman than a desperate cadet. Once he had gathered a modest bundle of branches, he returned to the small clearing he had chosen as his site. It lay slightly elevated from the rest of the grounds, where the soil was firm and dry, far less likely to turn into mud during rainfall. He thrust the first branch into the ground at an angle, pushing it deep until it stood upright. Then he planted another opposite it and bent them together, tying them at the top with strips of vine he had stripped from a nearby trunk. The arch formed a frame that was simple but strong. He repeated the action, creating 3 more arches in succession, each tied firmly at the top. The result was a skeleton of curved wood, lightweight yet sturdy, resembling a small rib cage rising from the earth. He moved next to the leaves. He plucked the broadest ones from the trees, leaves as long as his arm and thick with a natural waxy surface. He spread them across the wooden ribs, layering them like shingles, each overlapping the next so that water would run down the surface rather than seep through. He pressed the leaves into the branches with handfuls of mud, smearing the clay-like soil into cracks and edges. The mud acted like glue, binding the leaves to the frame and sealing gaps. His hands became caked with brown sludge, but he did not slow down. The rhythm of his work was steady, efficient, and calm, a stark contrast to the frantic exertion of the alien cadets around him. To reinforce the base, he dug shallow trenches with his hands and pressed smaller branches into them, weaving them horizontally across the frame like a primitive lattice. He stuffed the gaps with handfuls of grass and pressed more mud into the seams, creating insulation against both heat and cold. The structure was small, barely large enough for one person to crawl into, but it was airtight and compact. He knew instinctively that survival was not about grandeur. A small shelter could trap heat, stay firm against wind, and be built in minutes. Within 12 minutes of beginning, he stepped back and looked at what he had created. The lean-to stood at the edge of the plain, its mud and leaf walls dark against the pale soil. It was unremarkable in appearance, a crude construction compared to the crystalline towers or resin domes that rose elsewhere, but it was finished. The human wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving streaks of mud across the fabric, and crouched to test the interior. He crawled inside, stretched out, and smiled faintly as the air inside remained cool despite the punishing heat of the suns. It was not beauty that mattered. It was function, and the shelter already proved itself. As he sat inside for a moment, he remembered the forests of his homeworld, where storms came with little warning and children were taught from an early age to build cover from whatever lay at hand. His training had not come from instructors or carefully curated survival courses, but from life itself, where failure meant exposure, and exposure could mean death. Every movement he had made here came from those lessons, instincts carried across generations of human struggle. He was not building a monument to impress judges. He was building a barrier between life and death, and he needed nothing more than leaves, mud, and wood to accomplish it. Around him, the chaos continued, but he no longer paid it any attention. The shouting of crystalline cadets and the roars of growl warriors were background noise, fading into the distance as he tested the edges of his shelter, pressing against the frame to make sure it would not collapse. The mud had already hardened into a tough shell, and the leaves clung securely. He adjusted one seam with a final smear of soil, then sat back with satisfaction. 12 minutes had passed, and his shelter was complete. Some alien cadets finally noticed his work. A Grail paused mid-roar, his heavy arms cradling a half-broken log, and stared at the small structure in disbelief. A crystalline cadet scoffed, his voice dripping with scorn, claiming the thing would not last an hour. A charal clicked his mandibles in laughter, declaring the shelter no better than a child's plaything. Yet despite their contempt, an undercurrent of unease rippled through the crowd. While they still struggled with unfinished frames and collapsing walls, the human sat calmly inside his completed shelter, resting as though the challenge no longer concerned him. The instructor watched from a distance, his faceted eyes reflecting the sun. He gave no outward sign of approval or disapproval, but deep within him, the curiosity he had felt earlier sharpened into something keener. He had seen shelters of every type, grand projects that stretched into hours of labor, but rarely had he witnessed something so quickly constructed, so seemingly fragile yet so clearly functional. He wondered if the other cadets understood what had just happened. Perhaps not yet. But he knew the storm that approached would reveal the truth to everyone. The human, unaware of the instructor's lingering gaze, lay back inside the shelter and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the shade cool his skin. He was not smug, nor did he feel the need to boast. He had done what was necessary, and he knew that when the test of nature arrived, his work would speak for itself. The others could mock, dismiss, or ignore him, but in the end, survival did not bow to pride. It bowed only to those who understood it. A human cadet resting in the dark shade of a shelter built in 12 minutes, while the galaxy's proudest cadets continued to sweat, struggle, and fight against time. The contrast was undeniable, and though most refused to see it yet, the balance of the trial had already begun to shift. The first warning of the storm came as a subtle change in the air. The heat of the twin suns still pressed down, but a chill crept into the wind that curled across the training grounds, carrying with it the scent of dust and ozone. The insectoid cadets paused their resin work, their antennae twitching with unease. A crystalline Altarian tilted his head as faint vibrations hummed through the ground, vibrations too low for most to notice, but unmistakable to his faceted senses. The Grail warriors continued hauling logs, though their narrowed eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition. Something was coming, something vast and merciless, and the cadets who had spent hours boasting about the durability of their shelters now felt the first prick of doubt. The horizon darkened with speed that stunned even the most seasoned instructors. What had been a pale stretch of desert sky just moments before became a wall of shifting gray, a curtain of dust and rain driven by roaring winds. Lightning forked in the distance, jagged white spears splitting the horizon with blinding ferocity. The ground shuddered as the wind approached, carrying with it a force that seemed intent on tearing apart everything in its path. The instructor raised one crystalline arm in warning, his voice booming across the grounds, commanding cadets to retreat into their shelters. Pride and mockery gave way to urgency as cadets scrambled toward their half-finished constructions, pushing and shouting as the storm descended with terrifying speed. The insectoid cadets were the first to retreat into their resin dome. It glowed faintly in the fading light, its amber walls already hardened into a solid structure. Yet the resin, though strong against predators, was brittle against sudden force. As the first gust slammed into the dome, cracks formed like spider webs across its surface. The insectoids clicked frantically, layering more resin over the damage, but the storm was faster than their repairs. The dome shuddered, bent inward, and with a thunderous snap, one wall caved in, spraying shards of resin across the ground. Two cadets inside screamed as the wind tore through, scattering their supplies into the dust. The crystalline Altarians fared little better. Their walls, once geometric marvels of symmetry, became liabilities in the storm. The slabs of stone they had hammered together stood rigid, offering no flexibility against the shifting pressure. The wind slammed into their structure like a hammer against glass, and one shard split straight down the middle, collapsing onto the ground with a ringing crash. An Altarian cadet dove out of the way, his crystalline arm fracturing as he hit the dirt. Another screamed in rage as his flawless wall broke into fragments, each piece glinting cruelly in the lightning flashes. What had been a monument to geometry was reduced to rubble in seconds. The Grail warriors roared in defiance as the storm struck their wooden frame. Their logs, thick and heavy, seemed unmovable at first, but the vines holding them together snapped one by one under the pressure. The structure groaned, swayed, and toppled onto its side, sending a cloud of dust and splinters into the air. One Grail attempted to hold it upright with his bare arms, straining until his scales cracked, but the storm was too strong even for his brute strength. The shelter collapsed, burying him under a tangle of logs until his comrades dragged him free, their eyes wide with fear and humiliation. The Remnari cadet crouched under his clay dome, believing the hardened mud would shield him. But the storm brought not just wind and rain, but pellets of ice that struck with the weight of stones. Each impact chipped the clay, breaking it into chunks that crumbled under the relentless assault. The dome sagged and collapsed, leaving him soaked and shivering in the open as icy rain cut across his skin. The Etherean's shelter of sand slabs disintegrated even faster, her energy field flickering desperately as the storm pulled the particles apart. She floated above the wreckage, her luminous body dimming as exhaustion drained her strength. Across the training grounds, cadets shouted, fought, and struggled as the storm reduced their hours of labor to rubble in mere minutes. Resin shattered, stone cracked, wood splintered, and clay dissolved into mud. Pride dissolved alongside it, replaced by the raw terror of survival. The great traditions of clans and species, techniques refined over generations, collapsed under the indifferent fury of nature. At the edge of the plain, the humans' shelter stood unassumingly. The leaves pressed against the frame shivered under the wind, the mud sealing their seams cracked slightly, but the entire structure bent with the force instead of breaking. Inside, the human crouched low, his body pressed against the ground as the storm howled outside. Rain drummed against the leaf roof, sliding down the waxy surfaces and running harmlessly into the soil. Wind roared against the frame, but the branches bent like bows and sprang back into shape, never snapping. The shelter breathed with the storm, yielding where the alien structures had resisted and shattered. The human closed his eyes and listened. Each crack outside, each roar of collapse, each scream of frustration told him that the others had failed. He was not smug, nor did he take joy in their misery, but he understood now more than ever that survival was not about honor, tradition, or grandeur. It was about adaptation, about knowing when to bend instead of breaking, about choosing simplicity over pride. His shelter, built in 12 minutes with nothing but leaves, mud, and wood, proved stronger than the elaborate constructions of the galaxy's finest cadets. When the storm finally passed, the training grounds lay in ruins. Shards of resin littered the soil, logs lay scattered like bones, and crystalline shards glimmered among the mud. Cadets emerged from the wreckage drenched, battered, and humbled, their voices hoarse from shouting against the wind. Some looked around in disbelief, unable to accept that their hours of effort had dissolved so completely. And then their eyes turned, one by one, to the edge of the plain, where the human emerged from his shelter. His clothes were streaked with mud, his hair damp, but he stood calmly, brushing dust from his hands as though he had endured nothing more than a brief shower. Silence followed, heavy and undeniable. The cadets who had mocked him fell quiet, their pride crushed beneath the weight of reality. The instructor stepped forward, his crystalline body gleaming once more in the returning sunlight, his expression unreadable. Yet in his eyes lingered something that had not been there before: acknowledgement. The storm had tested everyone equally, but only one cadet had endured without collapse. And that cadet was human. The kind of silence that comes when certainty is broken and the world must be reconsidered. The cadets stood among the wreckage of their pride, and the human stood alone beside his shelter, the unspoken lesson already beginning to sink into the minds of those who had once dismissed him. The silence that settled after the storm was heavier than the rain-soaked soil beneath the cadets' feet. Broken fragments of resin, splintered logs, and shattered stone lay scattered like the remains of forgotten monuments. a physical testament to the futility of their efforts. Cadets stood among the ruins of their pride, their eyes wide, their voices muted, their bodies trembling not only from exhaustion, but from the sting of humiliation. The human emerged from his shelter without theatrics. His movements were calm, deliberate, as he brushed mud from his hands and surveyed the wreckage. He did not gloat, did not boast, and did not look down on the others. He simply stood, his small shelter intact behind him, a quiet declaration that survival was not a matter of grandeur, but of wisdom. The instructor walked forward with a measured grace, his crystalline body catching the rays of the returning suns. He scanned the grounds with his faceted eyes, taking in every collapsed structure, every defeated face, and every trembling cadet. His gaze lingered longest on the human, not with disbelief, but with something sharper: acknowledgement. When he spoke, his voice carried across the battered grounds with an authority that could not be ignored. He did not shame the cadets for their failure, nor did he praise the human openly at first. Instead, he began by stating the truth with unflinching clarity. Only one shelter had remained standing, only one cadet had met the requirement of the trial. The simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any insult. The cadets shifted uneasily, their pride forcing them to glance at one another, hoping to find comfort in shared failure. Yet the sight of the intact shelter silenced every attempt at denial. The insectoid cadets lowered their mandibles, their resin-stained claws twitching in shame. The crystalline Altarians looked at the shards of their fallen walls with vacant eyes, the geometry they had once treasured reduced to meaningless rubble. The Grail warriors clenched their fists, their muscular arms trembling with frustration, unable to comprehend how brute strength had failed against something so small and unassuming. The Remnari cadet sat in the mud with his ruined clay, his shoulders slumped in defeat, while the Etherean hovered weakly, her luminous glow dimmed to a pale flicker. All of them turned at last to the human, their faces a mixture of disbelief, resentment, and reluctant respect. The instructor finally broke the silence with words that none could ignore. He declared the human the victor of the trial, not because of luck, not because of favoritism, but because of understanding. He spoke of the human's ability to adapt, to assess the environment quickly, to build not what looked strong, but what acted strong when tested. He reminded the cadets that survival was not a contest of ego, but of practicality, and the human had embodied that truth with clarity none could deny. His words struck like a hammer, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, for lessons at the academy were not meant to flatter. They were meant to prepare cadets for the unforgiving reality of the galaxy. The human did not bow or smile when his name was called as the victor. He simply nodded once, his face calm, his eyes steady. He knew the storm had proven his shelter, but he also knew the storm had proven something far greater. The galaxy judged humans as fragile creatures, unsuited for the trials of hostile worlds, dismissed as reckless and primitive. Yet in this moment, with the wreckage of proud alien shelters scattered across the plain, those judgments crumbled like the walls of resin and stone. He had not only passed the trial, but also shifted the perception of what humanity meant within the academy. The other cadets, though bitter, could not look away. Some glared at him, their pride still too raw to accept the lesson. Others stared in stunned silence, their traditions shaken, their sense of superiority cracked. And a few, the most perceptive among them, felt a seed of something new take root within their minds: respect. They did not speak it, not yet, but they understood that the human's victory was not an accident. It was a reminder that simplicity could triumph over complexity, that instinct could defeat tradition, that survival was not about the grandeur of one's methods, but the effectiveness of one's choices. As the instructor dismissed the trial, the cadets dispersed slowly, each returning to his quarters with thoughts heavier than the storm clouds still lingering on the horizon. The alien students carried their shame like chains, but they also carried the image of a human who had endured with little more than leaves, mud, and wood. That image would remain long after the debris of their shelters had been cleared away. The human returned to his quarters without fanfare. He walked with the same steady pace he had shown during the trial, his face neither triumphant nor humbled, only resolute. He knew this was only one test among many, but he also knew this test mattered, not because it gave him victory, but because it had forced others to see him differently. The Academy thrived on competition, on pride, on the endless comparisons between species, but this trial had reminded every cadet that survival cared nothing for ancestry or honor. Survival cared only for those who understood how to adapt, how to bend without breaking, how to act with clarity in the face of chaos. That was the human lesson, and it had been written into the soil of the training grounds with a shelter that stood when all others had fallen. In the weeks that followed, whispers spread through the Academy's halls. Cadets spoke of the storm, of the wreckage, of the human who had finished his shelter in 12 minutes. Some spoke with anger, dismissing it as luck, others with grudging acknowledgement, and a few with admiration. But no matter how the story was told, the truth remained unchanged. The human had succeeded where others had failed. His name became a point of debate, his presence a reminder that humanity was not to be underestimated. For the human himself, the trial was not about fame or recognition. It was about survival, about proving to himself and to those who doubted him that he belonged in the Academy. He had not entered the challenge to win glory, but to endure, and in enduring, he had achieved something greater than victory. He had planted doubt in the minds of those who once dismissed his kind. Doubt, after all, was the first step toward respect. As the sun set on the Academy grounds, casting long shadows across the wreckage, the human stood by the window of his quarters, his reflection dark against the fading light. He thought of home, of the forests where he had learned to build shelters as a child, of storms that had shaped him into who he was. He knew more trials awaited him, trials that would test not only his body, but his spirit. Yet he also knew this truth. Survival was never about who was strongest, or fastest, or proudest. It was about who could adapt, who could endure, and who could face the storm with clarity and resolve. The story closed with that truth etched into the memory of the Academy, as indelible as the storm itself. One human had shown that survival was not a matter of tradition, but of instinct, not a matter of pride, but of humility. And though the galaxy might still see humanity as fragile, the Academy would never again see humans as weak.